Hello, and welcome to our patient education event today on repurposing for pediatrics. The theme of this event was specifically selected to help celebrate our 2020 Patient Impact Award recipients that we are honoring today, Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative and SPARK at Stanford. My name is Barbara Goodman, and I'm president and CEO of Cures Within Reach. We're a Chicago-based not-for-profit that finds and funds clinical and preclinical repurposing projects to take advantage of the speed and cost effectiveness provided when using proven therapies in new indications. Highlighted during the ongoing pandemic, this approach has led to over 1,000 clinical randomized control trials worldwide to find treatments for COVID-19. This includes remdesivir, approved in Japan and India this spring, now approved by the US FDA. Cures Within Reach is disease agnostic, we're geography agnostic, we're institution agnostic, and we're treatment agnostic. We work on projects in the pharmaceutical space, devices, diagnostics, as well as nutraceuticals and combination products. We focus on projects that catalyze follow-on funding. Our ideal time to fund is the pivotal proof of concept trial that, when successful, supports investment by the NIH, from industry, from philanthropy, and from others. For every dollar that we've awarded, which is now nearly $7 million, our funding has helped to catalyze nearly $9 million in follow-on funding for the research and these projects. Our ideal stage of funding, like I said, is the phase 1 proof of concept stage, since many organizations, including the NIH, industry, and larger foundations, often say to our researchers to come back when they have the initial data in a small number of patients and/or the dosing. And importantly, we remain patient-focused. We support patient access to viable treatments while building opportunities that create both commercial and philanthropic value. We fund projects regardless of their commercial or philanthropic value. Cures Within Reach has created a handful of repurposing communities aligned with many of our biggest stakeholders. Our 3 disease community areas are rare diseases, oncology, and neurology, which includes both mental health as well as neurodegenerative diseases. Our 3 geographic communities are Chicago, the Mid-Atlantic, and the developing world. And while the majority of our funded projects are clinical and human trials using already approved drugs and pharmaceuticals, we will fund projects that are repurposing already approved medical devices, diagnostics as well. As these statistics show, and as I said earlier, we are disease agnostic. In the rare disease space, current projects are funded by private foundations, by corporate partners, all of whom are aligned in the rare disease strategy, as well as individual donors and families who usually have a loved one with a specific disease. These projects are based in Massachusetts, in Michigan, in Tennessee, and are in brain cancer, blood cancer, immune disorders, and sight impairment diseases. In the neurological space, our projects are in PTSD, in depression, multiple sclerosis, even migraines and Huntington's disease. In the inner ear space, our funding comes from family foundations, family offices, private foundations, as well as individual donors and industry partners. Specifically in the inner ear space, this is an example where a specific family came to us wanting to make an impact in their disease area of interest. We can customize this approach for another family, another foundation, or another partner who's looking to make an interest and are flexible based on how involved or not involved our donors want to be. We have projects in the inner ear space in US, Germany, as well as Australia, with several more coming soon. In the infectious disease space, this is our newest area at Cures Within Reach. In addition to having 2 projects that are pending for COVID-19, we are now funding projects for dengue in South America, as well as tuberculosis in Africa. These are projects that are great examples of how we partner with Takeda, a major pharmaceutical company, to help build capacity for clinical research by funding clinical repurposing trials in low and low middle income countries, as well as funding research in underserved communities. And most relevant to today's topic is our ongoing treatments and pediatric projects. These are in rare and ultra-rare diseases, in oncology, as well as treatments for malnutrition and in dengue that I mentioned previously. In addition, over 40% of our recently completed projects are in the pediatric space. In addition to these 23 ongoing projects, we have 14 projects that have been approved for funding that we expect to be starting soon. These include 2 pediatric projects in oncology, as well as another rare disease. And we have projects in heart failure, sight impairment, oncology, and the COVID-19 projects I mentioned as well. And we are very excited that next week, of course, on Veterans Day, we are going to be launching a new clinical repurposing for veterans initiative, impacting veterans with unmet medical needs. I want to thank our repurposing community members and our patient education sponsors who together have provided the funds, allowing patients and caregivers to attend today for free or at a very steep discount. These organizations represent industry, healthcare services, and providers, as well as the philanthropic community, and we're so grateful for their support. Now my colleague Claire Thibodeau, our Director of Scientific Affairs, will get our panel session started and underway.
Great, thank you so much, Barbara, and thanks to all the attendees who are joining us here today. We are thrilled to explore the topic of repurposing research in pediatrics. We have a pretty straightforward format for you today. We'll begin with brief presentations from each of our panelists. That will be followed by a panel discussion and then some Q&A from the attendees. And this Q&A session is a great opportunity for you, the attendee, to get involved and get the answers to your burning questions about repurposing in pediatrics. The way that you do that is submit a question via the engagement panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Following the Q&A session, we'll move to our Global Health Repurposing Awards. Every year, Cures Within Reach recognizes repurposing leaders in the areas of philanthropy, industry, and research. And today, we're thrilled to be joined by our awardees in the areas of philanthropy and research. But of course, it wouldn't be a great event without some fantastic speakers. And I think that you will be engaged and informed by the speakers that we have joining us today. The event will be moderated by Dr. Mary Leonard from Stanford University and the Lucille Packard Children's Hospital at Stanford. Joining Dr. Leonard on the panel will be Ben McGraw from Auration Biotech, Teresa Persner from Stanford University and the University of Toronto, and Natalie Strub from DNDi. So without any further ado, let's get started. Mary, I'm going to turn it over to you to start the presentations.
Yes, good morning. Thank you so much. I'm just delighted to be here, and I'd like to extend my thanks to both you and Barbara for the opportunity to join you this afternoon. And I would like to commend Cures Within Reach for providing clinical trial funding at such critical stages of development, and especially to thank you for your focus on children today. As we'll discuss, there's many unique challenges, especially around the rare diseases and the ultra-rare diseases. In the weeks leading up to this event, I've enjoyed learning about the specific pediatric projects that you currently support. So I have three roles here at Stanford. I'm the chair of the Department of Pediatrics with 400 faculty and can speak to some of the academic incentives and maybe some of the alignment challenges we have around this kind of work. I'm the physician-in-chief at the Children's Hospital, but perhaps most importantly for today, I'm the director of the Maternal and Child Health Research Institute, which represents nearly 1,000 investigators. We are longstanding and steadfast supporters of the SPARK program in translational research here at Stanford, and have been pleased to support much of their work in maternal and child health portfolio, including multiple exciting new repurposing drugs in children. Also, the Child Health Research Institute has expanded our clinical trials office to provide much broader clinical research support. So a little over 5 years ago, the American Academy of Pediatrics convened a pediatric clinical trial stakeholder forum in Washington, D.C., with over 100 representatives from academia, industry, the FDA, the NIH, foundations, and patient advocacy groups. And the overarching objective was to accelerate the testing and dissemination of drugs and devices in pediatric patients. I participated in this forum, and some of the data I'll share in these opening remarks come from that meeting. Next slide, please. So you are here today because you know that children are not small adults and that children are underrepresented in clinical trials. As a result, infants and children may be prescribed treatments that are not effective or have unforeseen risk. Similarly, physicians may withhold potentially effective therapies because they are not indicated for pediatric use. The history of drug regulation over the last 50 years has been shaped immeasurably by serious harm to children caused by inadequately tested therapies. And the passage of the Pediatric Research Equity Act in 2002 marked an important chapter in efforts to improve the clinical study of novel therapeutics and devices in this vulnerable population. But as we will discuss, PREA has not fully met its early promise, and drug repurposing is an important tool in our toolkit to bring new safe and effective therapies to infants and children. Next slide, please. So drug development in pediatrics is slow and it is inefficient. Pediatric trials face many hurdles that adult trials do not. Because of this, pediatric trials often take longer and fail more frequently. More than 50% of drugs used in children, and actually more than 90% of drugs used in neonates, are prescribed off-label without adequate data. And it is because of these unique challenges that drug repurposing is such an important and promising strategy for pediatrics in particular. Next slide. So here's an example. I'm a kidney doctor, and I work with drugs for high blood pressure. And this is a clinical trial of a drug for the treatment of hypertension. And the trial was done in adults in 220 participants at 9 US sites, where they averaged 24 participants per site, and it took 5 months to complete. High blood pressure is far less common in children, but still very important. They needed to do the pediatric studies, but they had to go to many different sites. To get a comparable number of participants, they had to go to 70 sites in 3 countries. You can imagine the expense that this incurred, only 3.5 kids per site on average, and it took a year to complete. So that's just a nice example of how different the challenges are. Next slide, please. All right, so what are the barriers? Why is it that the pediatric is so much more challenging? So we have lack of dedicated pediatric clinical investigator sites, infrastructure, and trained personnel to support pediatric clinical research. Often trials are developed which really end up being poorly designed or infeasible in children. For example, I've been approached about studies that require daily blood draws of, in newborn babies with a volume of blood that's just not possible. And so we haven't had sufficient, expertise in designing some of these trials, so they can be infeasible. And there's also challenges around validated endpoints. The increasing financial costs are an important barrier, including inadequate personnel study costs given the small number of patients to enroll per site. You can imagine how much more expensive it is if you just have a few kids at a site as opposed to the prior example where they had 24 adults at a site. Another problem is misalignment with conventional promotion criteria at academic medical centers. When my faculty come up for promotion, the Committee on Promotion wants to see novel work with impactful publications. And for my faculty to really play an important role, much as a labor of love, to enroll 2 or 3 of their patients in an important study is very meaningful work, but unfortunately it's not the coin of the realm for promotion at academic centers. Because of these challenges, 40% of pediatric trials fail to meet their numbers, 60% stall in a significant way, and 30% of sites that are set up and ready to go, get IRB approval, actually never even enroll a single patient because of the lack of infrastructure and some of this misalignment. Next slide, please. All right, so Pediatric Research Equity Act was supposed to address much of this, and I mentioned that earlier that it hasn't lived up to its promise. As I said, it was passed in 2003 as a mandatory program that authorizes the FDA to require the study of new drugs or biologics in pediatric populations defined as less than 17 years of age. Under PREA, sponsors must submit data that assess the safety and effectiveness of a product in children. The Act's requirements apply to new drug applications and biologic license applications, including new indications and formulations. However, as detailed in an Institute of Medicine report recently, the program has been diluted by exemptions and study delays. So here's the crux of the problem. The FDA can waive the requirement for pediatric studies. For example, they think it would be highly impractical, or if the disease really exclusively affects adults. But more important for today's conversation is the exemption for orphan therapies. These are defined as drugs intended to treat diseases that affect fewer than 200,000 people in the United States. In fact, however, despite this exemption, orphan drugs accounted for nearly a third of all new drug approvals. Now, the majority of rare diseases have their onset in childhood, and more than half of orphan drug approvals involve conditions that affect both children and adults. So this exemption for the orphan drug is really quite problematic for pediatrics. And because orphan drugs are exempted, few of these drugs are subsequently studied in the relevant age groups, and there's many, many examples. So this was a study in JAMA Pediatrics, just published last year, that looked at all the drugs that were approved by the FDA between 2007 and 2014. You can see there's 438 of them on the left, but look how the majority, 3/4, were actually excluded from the need for pediatric data, a good chunk because of the orphan designation. So there were 114 that were moved forward with a pediatric requirement, but the graph on the slide shows how very, very slow it has been in terms of the completion. Next slide. And so after a median follow-up of 7 years, only 34% of pediatric studies that were mandated by the FDA have been completed, and only 40% of drug approvals include any pediatric labeling. So we're going to need a new strategy, and I think repurposing it is an important part of it. Next slide. This is a very interesting letter that was published by the former chair of the Children's Oncology Group. I think the Children's Oncology Group is really the standard bearer for how you run trials in very rare diseases at hundreds of sites around the globe. And Dr. Adamson pointed out an important loophole. He said, because cancer drug labels or market authorizations include a pathologic indication, for example, colon cancer or lung cancer, the fact that the pathologic disease does not occur in children results in a waiver of requirements for studying children, even though the mechanisms of action or the drug target may be relevant for childhood cancer. Thus, in the United States, Pediatric Research Equity Act requirements do not apply to cancer drugs, and only the financial incentive through the Best Pharmaceutical Children's Act is operative. So very nice to see that Cures Within Reach is really targeting some of the opportunities in oncology where this is such a critical need. Next slide. So the literature on drug repurposing in infants and children is very sparse, and it demonstrates that the scope and the potential for repurposing are not well appreciated in pediatrics. This is a study a few years ago where the authors conducted a systematic review of the 400 drugs most commonly used in children and said that a second use was found for about 10%, but most of these were just discovered by chance or serendipity and were not well studied or tested. The authors recommended more systematic approaches based on mining existing and structural databases, and it is clear that this is where the field is headed and where some of the work at Spark here is being done. As I'm sure you'll hear, more recent strategies include computational approaches such as pathway mapping, signature mapping, binding assays to identify relevant target interactions, molecular docking, and a variety of other strategies using novel dated sources. So it's really exciting that Cures Within Reach is shining a spotlight on the need for this work in pediatrics. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks and we'll move on to our panel. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. I think that was a fantastic overview of the issues facing clinical pediatric research and really puts the whole question into perspective for the attendees. So now I'll turn it over to Ben McGraw from Auration Biotech. Ben?
Good afternoon. My goal today is to give you an example of how new medicine for pediatrics is being developed and to encourage you to participate in clinical trials of investigational new medicines for kids. Stanford Spark is being honored today for its contributions to the development of new therapies in kids. I'll show you how they participated in the development of this new medicine. All right, so I'm going to do this as a story. All right, every good story has a hero and it has a villain. So, start with the hero. Who's the hero in this study? Well, I'm going to concentrate on two heroes. One is a guy named Peter Santamaria, and two is Spark. So, how do they fit in the story? Who's this guy, Peter Santamaria? Well, he went to medical school in Australia. And as a part of his training, he would go into the outback and see these kids that had chronic ear infections that developed perforations of their eardrum. There's no really good treatment for that. The only treatment is surgery, and it's not really that good. And it's definitely not available in places like where he was going. Okay, so what did he do about it? Well, he considered this to be a big deal. And he went after medical school back to graduate school and got a PhD in the molecular genetics of the eardrum. Now that is a serious commitment to solving a problem. So what did he do then? Well, he did work to figure out the protein that Mother Nature uses to heal these perforated eardrums. Okay, and then about that time, he moved to Stanford and he continued his work there. So the next step was he had to figure out how to create an animal model of what's going on in humans so he could develop a way to treat it. So he did that. Then he went on to develop a product based on the discovery he had made of the protein Mother Nature uses. Then he had to test it and test it and test it, multiple different animals, different doses. He had to compare it to other growth factors to make sure he had the right one. And this just went on and on. Now the question is, who paid for all this? Well, a lot of it was paid for by Spark. And this is really important. It's really hard for investigators to get early stage funding. This is where Spark comes in. They provide money, but more importantly, Spark has a full array of advisors that have terrific education and terrific experience. And they can provide help to the investigators to make sure that they're doing the right things. So Spark provided money, Spark provided access to these advisors. And then Peter would meet with these advisors on a quarterly basis, and the advisors would give him help in making sure he was doing the right work to develop the product appropriately. Many of those advisors are on this call today, and I'm very happy to be representing them and telling you about the great work that they do. All right, next. All right, what happened was after that was I got involved along with a guy named Sanjay Chanda. Sanjay is a very experienced drug development guy. Both of us are Spark advisors. So the first thing we did is we had to put together a development program. This means the animal studies, the human studies, the regulatory strategy, all this kind of stuff for the product. So we put together that whole development program. Then the next step is I had to find somebody that would pay for and run that program. That's a substantial commitment. The average drug costs between $1 billion and $2 billion to development. So it's an enormous financial commitment. When I went out to look at sources of funding, it became very difficult because there are very few products outside of antibiotics that have ever been developed for the ear. And people don't like to do things or fund things that haven't been done before. So it was really difficult to find funding. Well, we looked back, we met with lots and lots of venture capitalists and lots of companies and all. And we finally decided that Astellas, a Japanese multinational pharmaceutical company, was the best one to execute the program. So we started working with them. What did they do? Well, they did lots and lots more animal studies, including toxicology studies in adult animals and in pediatric animals. Their goal in doing all this work was to minimize the chance of something going wrong when the drug got into humans. Okay, so they also did a lot of work to make this product be convenient to use. And through their work, this thing is just as simple as an eardrop. And you can't get more simple than that. So it's a stable eardrop, which is terrific work on their part. How did Peter and Sanjay and I develop or work with Astellas? We work with the development team. We help them in design and interpretation of the results of all the studies, animals, the humans, regulatory strategy, all that sort of thing. What's next? Astellas is testing the product first in humans, and then they'll work their way back to the children after that. They start in small studies, small safety studies, and they go from there to larger studies that look at safety and efficacy, and then finally out into big safety studies. How long is this all going to take? Well, the average drug takes 6 to 8 years to develop. Then it is reviewed by the regulatory agency for about a year before it's approved. The entire process that I'm talking about generally takes about 12 years. It's a long time. Okay, who's the villain in the study? Mother Nature. I bet you didn't see that one coming. The problem is after all this work that we do early on in product development, once we go into human studies, 90% of the products fail. Usually it's because there's no efficacy. And that's because we're testing animals before, and animals are different species. So it's really, it's frustrating to do all that work and then take it into humans and find out that it actually doesn't do in humans what it did in animals. So there's your villain in the story. What's the moral of the story? Well, developing a new medicine is a long, complicated, expensive process, and it fails most of the time. All right, so last point, what can you do to help? Please consider volunteering for studies of investigation on new medicines. You'll learn a lot, and you'll be a part of the process that brings these new medicines to help other people like you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Everybody does love a good story, especially one that has a happy ending. I guess we'll have to kind of stay tuned to see what happens here, but I'm very hopeful that that this one will have a happy ending, and you know, many other happy endings coming up too. Next, I'll turn it over to Teresa Persner with Stanford University and the University of Toronto. Teresa?
Okay, can you hear me? Great. Hello, hi, I'm Teresa. I'm very delighted to be here today to share the story of how we repurposed an adult drug for pediatric brain tumor. And the brain tumor that I've been interested in for the past 10 years or so is medulloblastoma. It's the most common pediatric brain tumor, peaks around 47 years of age. And currently the therapeutic approach to it is really quite aggressive. So it includes gross total resection, so a big surgery, followed by irradiating the child's brain and their spine, and then a year of multi-drug chemotherapy. So you can imagine this type of approach would be challenging even in an adult, but in a young and developing brain, it's particularly problematic. So as a result, the children who do survive the disease end up with really significant neurological and cognitive morbidity as a result of the drugs themselves, not the disease. Furthermore, a lot of the kids who go through this, somewhat hellish regime end up still succumbing to the disease. So it's a very big problem. And as I was going through my neurosurgical residency, it's one that stood out to me, not only because of the devastation of the disease and the therapies that we're currently using, but also because unlike a lot of adult tumors that are driven by hundreds, sometimes thousands of mutations, medulloblastoma actually has a very well understood and specific underlying cause. And that cause is a single pathway. The science here is not important. It's just sufficient to know that this one pathway is driving a third of all of these tumors, which is really quite unusual. Not only do we know that this pathway is driving these tumors, but we actually know if we develop drugs that target just this one pathway, we can see even metastatic disease melt away from the child. Unfortunately, up to this point, every drug that we've created has ended up effective in the short term, but not effective in the long term because the tumor recurs as a result of the tumor mutating and becoming resistant to the drug itself. Nonetheless, what this has really taught us is that this one tumor driven by one pathway can have a significant benefit from a highly targeted approach. So ultimately here we have a tumor where we have a very strong understanding of the specific pathways driving it. But the drugs that we're using are still these historical non-targeted therapies that result in very significant long-term morbidity. And I want to pause here for a second and really highlight this last phrase, result in significant long-term morbidity. It's something you read about, something you hear about a lot in medical school, but it's very different when you read this in a book versus when you're telling it to a parent and their child. These conversations are devastating. Again, in neurosurgery, we have very many difficult conversations, but telling a parent not only about the diagnosis that their child has, but the therapies that you're going to give them will result in really serious side effects can be heartbreaking. And you have this conversation enough times, as I did, especially early on in your training, that the emotional connotation of that, combined with this understanding that we do know more about the science than is reflected in the disease, this was enough to motivate me to actually leave clinical neurosurgery and go off to Stanford with one very clear goal. And that goal was to discover a specific druggable target for hedgehog medulloblastomas that was resistant to these mutations that all their drugs have been vulnerable to up to this point. And that's how I ended up going down this path away from neurosurgery. I won't go into how I found this target. It's very interesting to me, but not necessarily to everybody else. I'll just say that what I did is I took this cancer biology problem and I combined it with developmental neurobiology and these innovative approaches in mass spectrometry to identify a specific target. And my PhD was actually in developmental neurobiology, not cancer biology. Through this approach, I was able to identify a target, and that target was called CK2. That target had everything that I wanted. It was in the hedgehog pathway, this one pathway that was driving a third of the tumors. It was a druggable target. Not all proteins are equally druggable. And it was resistant to these single mutations. So not only did it have the characteristics that I wanted, but when I put tumors into mice and I allowed them to grow over time, these were tumors that were resistant to all the other targeted therapies. You can see in this graph the tumors growing. If I treated those mice with a drug that specifically targeted CK2, you can see that the tumors stopped growing. Not only did they not grow, but they regressed. They disappeared. When we put these same very aggressive tumor cells into the brains of mice, you can see that all the mice that were not treated died within about 18 days, whereas the ones that were treated with this very targeted therapy continued to survive beyond a year, even after only 30 days of treatment. So this was really astonishing to me. And it seemed like the toxicity associated with it, at least in this very small group, what was relatively trivial. We couldn't find anything in particular. And so here I left. I found a target that was promising in mice. And the question was, what do I do now? And I always thought as a scientist that your responsibility was to make this discovery, publish it as a paper, and then someone would come along and take your paper and ding, make a wonderful drug for you. It turns out it doesn't work that way. Not only does it not work that way, but this is a really challenging process that is really wrought with failures. So this is an image that a lot of people show, and it basically shows that for every 5,000 compounds, about 5 make it to clinical trial. And so for me, who had courageously gone from patient back to bench, going back from bench to bedside didn't seem quite as easy. And not only was there this giant gap, but it seemed like there was a 99.9% chance that I would somehow fail between where I was and what I wanted to be. And so I like going against the odds, but these were pretty bad odds. I called them fairy godmother level odds. And luckily I had one. I found a fairy godmother at Stanford, and that fairy godmother was Spark. So Spark was really just amazing. But what they did is they took this giant intimidating chasm between my discovery and getting it to patients, and through a lot of mentorship from many different people, all of whom seemed terribly overqualified to be talking to a little neurosurgery resident and graduate student, I was able to fill this chasm with different approaches. None of them were easy, but each of them could be broken down to steps that were challenging, but seemed doable. And so we talked a lot. There was two basic routes that I could go. One was to create a drug myself based on the compound that I was using in my preclinical studies with the mice. The other option was to repurpose a drug. There was only one CK2 inhibitor that had started in development. It was through a smaller biotech company. They had tried it, and they'd done phase 1 trials in adults at that point, but hadn't progressed beyond that. And after a lot of discussion, and really this was important discussion, just deciding which path to go down, we decided to go with repurposing. It seemed like it would be the faster and more likely to succeed way. So we took those 4 problems now and we started tackling them. The first was to get the Pediatric Brain Tumor Consortium on board. They're a multi-center institution that drives, that funds and supports a lot of the early stage pediatric brain tumor trials. It's ran out of St. Jude. And luckily that didn't actually require a whole lot of convincing. They saw the preclinical data, they were excited by it, they knew Spark was on board. And so we actually got them on board quite early. It's ran out of St. Jude. The next thing was to get some intellectual property built around it, which we were able to do again through the Stanford OTL, the Office of Technology Licensing. And then the final thing was to consider, okay, how are we going to actually do this? As Mary highlighted, creating a viable path forward for pediatric indications is extremely challenging. And I was going to have to somehow convince Senwa Bioscience, which is this small little company that had the drug that I wanted, to let me use their drug. And this is a really non-trivial problem. Having now been on the opposite side, where I have a company that has a board that I'm responsible to, you're basically telling these people that you know better than they do what they should do with their drug, the drug that they have put their heart and sweat and tears into, and that they could convince their board that they should do your indication. And not only that, your indication is a pediatric indication, which is expensive, it's challenging, the design of the clinical trial is extremely non-trivial, and it's wrought with failure. Morbidities happen, side effects happen in kids that might not have happened in the adult indication, and if you get a bad morbidity in a child, it could really derail their adult indications. And so it's hard to do that. And the cherry on top is that the financial incentives, pretty low. And so, that was really the biggest step. I went back and I looked at how many emails Kevin and I had back and forth. There was 132 emails, many phone calls with Senwa Bioscience. And actually Kevin got on a plane with me and flew down to San Diego to talk to them in person. And with his help and with a lot of involvement of the PBTC, we were actually able to convince them to let us use their drug. So that was quite the coup. Another way I like to really put this is this is me, this is the problem without Spark. So one little underqualified person with no right to bridge this tremendous gap. And then here's now me with Spark. I'm surrounded by people, all of whom are very compelling and convincing people. One of the people we relied on for sure was the Stanford Innovative Study Design Group, again, creating studies for these very rare pediatric orphan diseases that are pediatric brain tumors. It is difficult, and it required really innovative trial design and several conversations with the FDA just to make sure that what we were doing was feasible. So here's the overall timeline of how things went. In January 2015, I was awarded the Spark grant, and that was really to do the preclinical studies, all the mouse work that I showed you, and to identify the lead, what we want to go forward with. In March was the first time we had the face-to-face with Senwa. That was March 2016. That's when Kevin and I flew down. Then we went through many hurdles, and ultimately by May 2018, so about 2 years later, we were able to submit the full protocol to NCI. In January 2019, we underwent centralized IRB. February of 2019, the study was activated, and then in May, we had our first patient. Here's our study on clinicaltrials.gov. It was really kind of exciting to see that for the first time. Usually I'm looking for studies to enroll my patients in. It's not my study that's up there, so that was quite an exciting moment. And then just sort of the big picture, 2019 is when the pediatric medulla phase 1 started. They actually went after the second hedgehog-driven tumor, which is basal cell carcinoma, so they decided to go along that route given the effectiveness against the pathway. In 2020, we actually just started the adult medulloblastoma phase 0-2. So we started the first stage of that, and then we were able to progress the pediatric medulloblastoma trial to phase 2. And then in 2021, we're hoping to continue on with the pediatric phase 2. So many thanks to my amazing mentors. Up at the top are my surgical mentors who allowed me to leave for 6 years. Again, Daria and Kevin, just absolutely fantastic through Spark. Many other advisors through Spark. And then Matt and Minx were my thesis advisors who helped with a lot of the guidance. And then the biggest thanks, of course, is to my husband, also a neurosurgeon, also working on the same problem as I am. And then all my funding sources. Yeah, I think I'm on time. So thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. That's a really fascinating story of bedside to bench to bedside. And
can't make up my mind. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it really shows how collaboration among many groups is really important to get these trials going and to get treatments, repurposed treatments to pediatric patients.
For sure. We never had any private funding, so everything we did was through nonprofits. So it's absolutely critical.
Excellent. So now I'm going to turn it over to Natalie Strub from DNDi, and she will give us a slightly different perspective on repurposing for pediatrics. Natalie?
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for inviting DNDi to this panel and this meeting. We're very happy to be here. I have to say I've been very impressed by your presentations and especially Teresa, because I think you're illustrating, the struggle to get something from bench to bedside, from patients to, to cure, and it's quite impressive what you have achieved. So DNDi, we're a bit different. We're a not-for-profit R&D organization. Maybe next slide, please. We were funded in 2003 with the Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, Peace Nobel Prize. And the idea was, to face the neglect and try to address the needs of neglected populations, neglected patients, who did not fit in the for-profit industry market and were thus abandoned by research. And I think you will see the similarities with the pediatric questions. So our objective is to discover, develop, and deliver new treatments for neglected patients around the world, a small set of those diseases, and to make sure that our treatments will also be accessible and therefore affordable to the settings where they will be delivered. The next slide shows you what we have achieved for the past 15 years. So you can see first the diseases where we have been investing: sleeping sickness, Chagas disease, mycetoma, filarial diseases, in fact, river blindness, leishmaniasis, which includes visceral form of leishmaniasis, the cutaneous form of leishmaniasis, HIV pediatric. I'll speak a little bit more about this. We also have engaged in finding accessible treatments for hepatitis C. We have a sort of spin-off organization looking at antimicrobial resistance, and I have to say here with a specific program on neonatal sepsis. And we started, in fact, by developing 2 treatments for malaria, which are obviously targeting the needs of children. And so the next slide shows you characteristics typically attached to neglected tropical diseases. And again, when you think of this, you will see the similarities, I would say, with the pediatric gaps. So NTDs typically are affecting poor populations, which might be the only difference, I would say, with the systematic pediatric development. They are associated with high morbidity and mortality. There is very often stigma and discrimination, which will affect mothers and mothers who will deliver and transmit to their babies some of these diseases. Affect mostly voiceless populations who are not going to be able to advocate for their own needs, who live in tropical and subtropical regions. Also, some of these diseases now move and affect populations not only in tropical areas, and are, and that's the key point, very often neglected by scientific research. So NTDs, and that's the good news, are now targeted by the SDG goals, but I think SDG goals also address the pediatric needs. And NTDs in general affect about 1 billion population, but half of it being children. And what we see here, what you see on the graph, is what we call the vicious cycle of poverty, because being poor makes you vulnerable to these diseases, which for treatment makes you even more poor, which entertains the poverty cycle. So what we are trying to do modestly is to find solutions to break this terrible cycle by finding solutions for NTDs. But let's speak a little bit more about repurposing now. And why is it that repurposing is useful? So it's been it may be the next one. It's been already presented by the previous speaker. So this shows you the typical evolution of all the things we need to do when we develop a new treatment. So we start by discovery, we look at targets, then we optimize a molecule, then we make sure it can be easily absorbed and distributed. We test it in some animal models, and then we move to man. In fact, when you're talking of repurposing, you can start, as was very well mentioned before, at the phase 1, which is the healthy volunteer first in human stage, or you can come later. And you can even use a drug that has been registered and then only test it in the new indication, which is the one you are repurposing for. Can you press on the next animation, please? So in fact, by doing repurposing, it is very clear that you're already saving not only the money, but the time that gets you to the lighter blue part of the evolution. The other thing is that you will de-risk safety issues, because toxicology and things which Ben spoke about earlier are going to be resolved because you have finished this work. You're increasing your chances of success, because sometimes when you start after POC, you have an idea of the mechanism of action, exactly like Teresa was mentioning, and obviously you're saving costs. So it becomes more attractive. The next slide is showing you our portfolio, and if you would like to just animate twice. So the pediatric use is shown here, and here the pediatric formulation. So maybe I'll stop a little bit on this slide. So this is the overall DNDi R&D portfolio of last June. It evolves quite rapidly. So on the left side, you have discovery. We then move to translation, development, and implementation. So I'm sorry because it's very small, probably. What I'd like to illustrate here is that, yes, we are developing treatments for NTDs, but as you can see, for sleeping sickness, for visceral leishmaniasis, and for malaria, we have developed formulations that were adapted also for pediatric use. So it means that we benefited from the, usually that's the way it's done, you test in adults, you make sure you have efficacy, you have demonstrated proof of efficacy in your adult population, you document safety, and then you will redo a study that will allow you to have a label that includes children. And obviously for these NTDs, this is what we have done. But more importantly, sometimes you only have to do, must do development for pediatric indication per se. And the first one we developed at DNDi was on basnidazole. Basnidazole is an old drug that's been used for the treatment of Chagas disease. But Chagas disease is transmitted through mother-to-child congenital transmission. And when babies are affected by Chagas disease, the disease can be more severe. And the treatment we usually had, the formulation we had with basnidazole was something you had to crush into, or you have to split the tablet into sometimes 12. And obviously you couldn't do that. So we knew that the dose that was given to these babies who really needed a treatment was wrong, either not enough or too much. And basnidazole is not a very well tolerated drug. So we engaged into a pediatric formulation development, which was registered and is used and has been approved by the WHO on the essential medicines list. But we also are engaging in this program on pediatric formulations for HIV, which I will speak about on the next slide. So HIV is a very well nourished pipeline. There's been a lot of research for adults. However, and there's been a lot of programs for mother-to-child prevention, or prevention of mother-to-child transmission, I should say. But these programs are not working as they could, or as they could in sub-Saharan Africa, which means that a lot of babies are born with the virus, and only 52% of them are getting treatment. And what we know is that when a baby is born with HIV, its life expectancy is reduced by 50% at the age of 2 years old. So it's absolutely dramatic to be born with HIV. In fact, there is a treatment which is made of lopinavir, ritonavir syrup, but this treatment is based on alcohol. It's extremely bitter. It requires cold chain. It has to be administered several times a day, meaning that in fact for mothers, it's impossible to treat those babies with this treatment. So what we did is, and that was also pushed by our MSF colleagues, was to identify if we could work on something that would remove the need to give these, in fact, not deployable treatment to these babies. And so we worked with our industrial partner, which is our model, and here it is with Cipla, who developed first a sprinkle form, which was quite good, but not acceptable by mothers enough. So our objective is to have 4 of the drugs that are usually given to those babies in sprinkles that you can add to the food and give to babies, or milk, and give to the babies so that they can be treated without any problem, and make sure that they will be able to grow and then move to another formulation. So that's one of the examples. If we look at the challenges on the next slide of pediatric development, again, I'm just repeating what you heard before, but maybe I'd like to insist on one point. And Barbara mentioned that you were agnostic on diseases. When we develop the target product profile, we are agnostic on what that product is. The purpose here of a target product profile is to say, okay, what is needed for this population I want to treat? What is it? What are the characteristics that I need to fill to be able to provide a solution that works for patients? And so you shouldn't think of, I have this and therefore I will adjust my efficacy, my formulation. No, the idea is really to come, bring the right stakeholders around the table and ask them what they need. In fact, for pediatric development, the key thing is about formulation. Is it going to be sprinkles? Is it dispersible? Is a syrup acceptable? How many times can mothers, caregivers administer it? If it's a chronic disease or if it's an acute disease? What is the ease of administration? Do you need taste masking? What is acceptable as taste masking? Do you need to administer it with food or with milk? This will drive your entire development. The other hurdle in developing these formulations of these treatments is understanding the pharmacokinetics and understanding what kind of dose you have to give, depending on the age of your children and depending on the maturation of the different organs which will metabolize or eliminate or distribute the drug in the body. And this is not simple, but there have been a lot of progress in PBPK modeling, and you can help with these models based on what you know about the drug, what you know about standard metabolism, depending on the age. You can try and mimic what will be the best dose to achieve the concentration that you know is going to be effective and safe based on other data. It's a lot of work, but it can be done without exposing any children. And in fact, regulators are now accepting that you come with some justification on PBPK, which obviously saves time and money. But then you also have to go to regulators and understand, based on what you have seen with adults, and I don't know how Teresa managed this, but it would be interesting to know, what is it that the regulators will accept to give you a label that allows children to be treated. So in the case of the 4-in-1, I have to say, just to give you an example, that so we had the treatment. The question was not the treatment. The question was the formulation. And so the formulation, as I said, was extremely bitter. When you have it, when you taste it, you have this bitter taste for an hour or 2 hours. So the whole work was about masking this bitter taste, but keeping the drug bioavailability in the blood. And every time we masked, we lost some bioavailability. So it took a lot of time to adjust and find, the ways with good chemists to adjust so that you would have the exposure, but you wouldn't have the bad taste. That was a big challenge. Then the other challenges, and I think, again, you heard from Mary, I was impressed by the numbers of sites when you said that, but yeah, conducting trials requires maybe for NTDs it's a bit different because we go for these children because there's quite a number that are requiring this. So, but it's still a challenge to do these clinical trials. There are some issues with ethical, informed consent, making sure mothers understand, and that can be quite complicated. And of course, the funding issue is one that we cannot omit. So if we look at the next slide, it's showing you just an illustration of what the TPP for HIV for. So I'm saying TPP for HIV, as you can see, what it is. It's on our website. It's extremely small. What you see, the two columns are called ideal or acceptable. And what we say here, and that was before we had, even engage in the program, is what is it that is needed for a pediatric HIV treatment? So you have for the treatment regimen, you have the frequency of administration. And for the formulation, there's a lot about the taste masking, as you can see here, which is in fact in the palatability, which is special for HIV, and the formulation describes whether, if it's a fixed dose or etc. But that's an example of what a pediatric HIV TPP is. So is it going to be feasible to register these drugs? Are there any incentives? So looking at, again, sorry, I'm repeating what you've heard before on the next slide, it's evolution of the pediatric regulation and progresses here. So I think Mary knows this better than I, but you can see that there have been some regular, between FDA and EMA, it's interesting to see it's and 1980s, some people have started to think, well, there's something wrong. We need to address, children who are not small adults, and how can we incentivize the researchers and the pharmaceutical industry. So there have been more and more initiatives to try and give some IP, more IP duration with the protection with pediatric development engagement. So these are sort of regulatory incentives. It came from them. There's also been the Children Essential Medicines list that was created in 2007 by the WHO. You mentioned the Creating Hope Act in 2012 in the USA, which is in fact a way of providing a priority review voucher to companies that would develop a treatment for pediatric cancer diseases, and in exchange for the next drug that they would put on the market, they would get a priority review, which is thought to be a kind of 4 months on market incentive, which is not nothing. And there's also been the Global Accelerator for Pediatric Formulation initiative by the WHO, which is really looking at finding ways of developing user-friendly, accessible, affordable, well-adapted formulations for children. And so this is quite recent, and we are just about understanding what this GAP-F formulation will do, but it's quite encouraging. So maybe the conclusion for now on the next slide is clearly that repurposing will and can accelerate access to treatments whilst minimizing the risks and costs. Children's specific medical needs require very early engagement with stakeholders to define the TPP, with manufacturers to address formulation issues, with regulators to understand the regulatory pathway and the development plan, and with community and clinicians for clinical trials and acceptability. I think we shouldn't ignore and underestimate the need for acceptability studies. And the development for children indication will benefit from adult development, but must be considered as a standalone funded program. We cannot ignore this. And I think I'll stop now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nathalie, for really reminding all of us about the global impact of repurposing for pediatrics and for adults. It's a really great perspective for all of us to keep in mind. And thank you again to all of the speakers today. There were some wonderful presentations, a lot of really fantastic content, and I know I can't wait to get into the panel discussion. But before we do, just a quick reminder to all the attendees, please continue to submit your questions via the engagement panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will be sharing that with the attendees during the Q&A the panelists during the Q&A sessions. So with that, Mary, let's get the discussion going.
Okay, thank you. I want to echo your comments, congratulating and thanking each of the speakers for these wonderful presentations and for the great work that they're doing every day. So Ben, I'm going to start with you. You are our first speaker. I just want to say one note about our hero, about Peter Santamaria. I just want to note that he also had the benefit of some philanthropy. The Lucille Packard Foundation in Children's Health has generated endowments that the Maternal and Child Health Research Institute rotates, and they're wonderful endowments that our scientists can hold for 5 years. And so really as a reflection of the Maternal and Child Health Research Institute's enthusiasm for the work that he's doing, he is the current recipient of one of these faculty scholar endowments for work entitled Sensory Hearing Loss and Chronic Suppurative Otitis Media. So just wanted you to know that. So my question for you is, how does industry decide whether to pursue a pediatric product of indication or for indication?
Okay. Both Mary, you and Nathalie have explained the regulatory process. So anytime for every product that we take to the US or EU regulatory agencies, we either have to have a pediatric plan or a waiver. And this thing happens in all kinds of weird ways. There's the formal process, but also I'm involved with another company where we're developing a drug, and we went into FDA for pre-IND meeting, and we laid out the clinical plan. And at the end, they said, "Have you thought about developing this in children?" And we said, "Not really. We didn't even realize this was a problem in children." And they said, "Look into it." And so we were nobody had done any work. But then about a month later, a study came out showing that this, in fact, was a problem, fairly common problem in kids. And I guess maybe they had access to the data that we'd never seen, but then it caused us to put together a pediatric development program for the product. But the bottom line on whether, outside that, the bottom line on whether industry or how industry decides whether or not to invest in a product gets down to one simple point, and that is return on investment. So I'm going to give you insight that that's really, really valuable. It will help explain why industry does what it does. And what drives that is that in industry, we have shareholders that put money into the company. And we take that money and we invest it in research programs to come up with products. And the goal of that is to give them an acceptable return on investment. If we don't give them an acceptable return on investment, they'll just put their money somewhere else. And we go out of business, and then there's no opportunity. So how do we make that assessment on our estimate of what the return is going to be? Well, we look at the time required to put a product on the market, the development cost, the probability of success, the regulatory probability of success, assuming it does get on the market, what's going to be the likely reimbursement price from the insurance companies? Where's it going to fit in the formularies? Is it going to be first line, second line, third line, whatever? Whether physicians are likely going to accept it or not, what the marketing costs, synergies with other products that we would already be working on, that sort of thing. So you do all that work and you come up with an assessment of what's called discounted net present value. So it's the value of this program. If it looks like it's going to be a good return for our shareholders, we make the investment. If it isn't, you just really can't.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. You know, I mentioned that I'm a kidney doctor, and less than 1% of the people on dialysis in this country are children. So it's been hugely problematic to get companies to do the work in children for the exact reasons you talked about in the whole return on investment. So I'm sure we could talk about this for a long time, but I want to make sure I get questions for other speakers. So thank you very much for that. So Teresa, one of the things I mentioned is some of the challenges within the academic environment on what committees on appointments and promotions, what boxes they're looking to check in terms of the accomplishments of the faculty. And you've been in that environment and you know well. Could you say a little bit about the challenges related to incentives that impact pediatrics and some of the issues of that where that's maybe unique to repurposing in that context?
Yeah, I think there's definitely something exciting and unique about developing your own drug and building a company around it and raising funding and this and that. And you know, I've built a company for another reason, and certainly there's excitement and there's flashiness to that, and there's a lot of recognition for that does push your career forward in a way that repurposing a drug doesn't. It's a lot of work to repurpose a drug. It's a tremendous amount of work. I don't think that there is an easy way to get a drug to kids in clinic. There's different challenges doing one versus the other, finding the financial incentives, doing it yourself privately. But when you're repurposing a drug, you are at the whim of the company that owns that drug, and they can pull the plug on you. They can have a change in management. They can have a change in direction. And then suddenly all your work goes to nothing and they just cancel the trial going forward. And so I think there's no easy way there, and the challenges of repurposing a drug are really underappreciated. That being said, I think you do what makes sense. You follow where the science is taking you and where the patients are asking you, and as long as you do that in a way that's transparent and honest and sincere, I think you're going to get the promotion. So I think it's a problem, but I also think that if you're really devoted to what you're doing, people recognize that and the importance of that.
So at the Clinical Trial Stakeholders Forum that I mentioned that had over 100 participants, we invested a significant amount of time talking about how we have to educate the deans of the schools of medicine around the country that we need to place a greater value on team science, around the importance of rolling children, in particular in clinical trials, because if you're one of 53 sites, you're not going to get a high impact publication out of that. So that's something else that concurrently the academic leaders need to do around this issue. And I do think we're starting to get a little bit more traction there. For the coin of the realm usually is just peer-reviewed publications where you're the first or last author, and if you're one of 50 sites enrolling kids, that's not gonna be forthcoming. So we'll continue to work on some of these issues. All right, and then for both, for multiple examples here, we've recognized that the pediatric indication does not have the commercial value that an adult indication has. And Natalie, I'm wondering if you could talk about the importance and the roles of not-for-profit organizations around this specific area. And I was really struck when you made the comment that your NTD characteristics are similar to some of the pediatric gaps. And I would imagine the commercial value in some of the populations you fund is also not as advantageous as it might be in other settings. Maybe you could comment a little bit more on that.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, there's zero commercial value. In fact, that's exactly what we showed in the first paper in 2002. We looked at the drugs that were developed for neglected tropical diseases versus the morbidity, and there was only less than 1% that were developed as you know, the morbidity affected about 10% of the population, and that's very clearly because these populations do not represent a profitable market, and therefore the industry did not see exactly what Ben mentioned, which is the return on investment. So the model of DNDi was to try and find ways of benefiting from the good molecules, the libraries from the industry, from the views of some public health, to try and get public health interested and funding DNDi, and to try and get philanthropics to fund us as well. And in fact, DNDi is quite equally funded by private and public partners. Public partners being governments who feel that for through different mechanisms they see value in either via the aid systems or just the ministries of health. They fund us, and we also have private partners. I think it's a good model. We by doing this, by having this product development partnerships, we de-risk a little bit the impact of the cost impact of the industry, but we give the reward to the industry, who then fulfills their corporate social responsibility. I wouldn't say obligations, but promises. So we know of some industries. I mean, we have a lot of industry partnership. We couldn't do it without partnerships. And so I've mentioned Sanofi, I could mention Eisai, I could mention Bayer, I could mention Takeda, I could mention more Cipla. So many of the industry are helping us. And I think that's where you have to find another model, because it was well explained by Ben, and we respect this. But there are other ways of doing it. And I think it's this type of new avenues, the financial mechanisms that have been, incentives that have been put forward with the orphan designation, plus the PRV are other incentives. So there's a way, but it's not a straightforward one, and you have to find the niche, find the interest, and find the partners. And I think that's probably one of the messages. And again, what Cures Within Reach is doing is exactly that, because it's de-risking so that it becomes less expensive when you start, developing at a phase 2. Your attrition risk will be lower, and so your investment and your return on investment yield will be much higher. So these are sort of ideas that I can suggest.
That was wonderful. And I really want to thank you for the slide where you emphasize the advantages of repurposing. I think anybody who's joined us today understands the values of repurposing, but thinking about the fact that the toxicology is already addressed and the issues around de-risking, if you look at that all the barriers to doing these pediatric studies, that really leapfrogs over a number of them. And my sense from reading the literature is that it's really been underutilized, under-recognized in pediatrics, I think, and the forums like this are a really important opportunity. So my ears perked up when you used the term corporate social responsibility. Ben, can you talk a little bit from the industry perspective on when that becomes part of the conversation?
Well, okay, so I gave you the financial answer, but in the interest of time, I didn't want to get off into the social responsibility side of it. So, we have to provide a good return for investors, or they pull their money and we don't have a chance to do anything else. But we work really hard to find ways to justify things that are not really good investments, and that goes on a lot. And we do that because of exactly what Nathalie was talking about. It's a social responsibility. That's the synergy concept I referred to at the very end there. You work really hard. If you're in a field already and you want to be supportive of the field, you'll do things that are not financially sound just because you want to support the field. That's what it really gets down to.
Oh, thank you. So again, at this clinical trials forum that I took part in, the patient advocacy, the families and the specific disease advocacy groups have so much passion and desire to help move the field forward. And Teresa, I'm wondering if you or maybe any of the speakers have some ideas about how the parents, the caregivers, what they can take away from this meeting, and how can they help with this agenda, and how can some of these successes be applied to other rare pediatric diseases?
Yeah, I think my entire project and the ability to do it was based on philanthropy. It was based on funding that was given to me, at a very early stage in my training. And so I think one of the big things that I took away from this whole process was the fact that it's really challenging, and to go after orphan diseases, even with all the regulatory things that have been put forward in Korea and the Creating Hope Voucher and everything like that. It's hard to do it in a financially rewarding way. And so we are highly dependent on nonprofits and on parents. And I think, Nancy Goodman was the one who pushed forward a lot of these Creating Hope Vouchers. Her child had medulloblastoma, and she worked directly with me to convince this company to let me use their drug. She was very powerful in convincing them. And ultimately it was just the pressure that was put on them by advocacy groups and by Nancy Goodman and by a lot of other people going to the FDA, going to the NIH, going to the company directly saying this trial has to happen. I really think that that's ultimately how they got convinced to come on board. They realized that they would not get away just ignoring it. And so I think there's a tremendous amount that they can do. And I would really also advocate for funding sources that don't discriminate against the stage of training. So I was early and I got funding that was open to anyone. It wasn't dedicated to graduate students. It was just an open call for projects, and I got one through Spark. And so I think recognizing the importance of getting people like me early, who maybe wouldn't have gone the route of drug development. My intention was basic science, but getting me hooked early on and then creating a person who will continue to do this for the rest of their career, I think is really important.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I've been involved with other rare diseases like cystinosis, where simple things like a drug that has to be taken every 4 hours, the parents really drove the research on changing the formulation. And I think it's been It's incredibly inspirational what some of the patient and parent family organization, advocacy groups have done. Okay, so I'm looking down my list of questions. I guess I'm going to come back to Natalie for the last question because I know we want to have time for to shift to the attendee Q&A. But you've been so successful, despite the fact that there's not a good financial return on investment, despite all of these challenges. Do you have any suggestions for how academia could work more effectively with some of the not-for-profits to help drive some of these changes? Any suggestions or experience?
Thank you. It's a very difficult question, but I think it's what I've heard already. It's, there's no magic recipe, but it's when you're involved in a disease is to try and get the right partners around the table. Everyone that will have a role to play in your development. Everybody achieving and wanting to achieve the same goal with the same vision. You will need a lot of different skills. And academia will have some of the skills, industry will have others, funders will see something, policymakers need to be there, patients advocates, families, all of those, and you can't do it without having everyone. Then things sort of get together and you start having a project that becomes more, solid, cohesive. You have an end-to-end strategy. You can build a plan. You can get some advocacy. You can convince funders that you will get to results, because I think everybody understands when you start explaining. Just listen to the stories we've heard today. It's difficult not to understand there's a need. It's just people sometimes think it's going to be too complicated and all of that. So I don't have any magic recipe, and every of our single, neglected disease is different. And the partners are different, the strategy is different, everything's different, but it's understanding what you need to build this and relying on the fact that there is an overall global WHO, FDA, EMA, acknowledgement that this needs to happen. So if you're solid enough in your partnership to show that you have the right people, you should be able
thank
to
you.
get
And I'll just say, I have multiple faculty in my department, pediatric infectious disease, people doing work in Zika and other things. And the first thing I'm going to do after this meeting is make sure they're very familiar with your organization, because I can see some exciting opportunities. Okay, the attendee questions that are pouring in are just outstanding, having taken a quick look. So let's jump right in. And I'm going to ask our panelists, maybe raise their hand if who wants to jump in on this one. What role does real world data play in identifying the potential for repurposing? Ben.
I believe in this to the extent that I talked my son into doing this. I think it's a tremendous source of information. There's lots and lots of data. The issue is being able to do an appropriate analysis so that you don't get misled.
Great. Anybody want to add anything else?
I may just want to mention the QRID initiative, which is in fact collecting, it's exactly collecting real world data in a very organized way, exactly for that purpose. So I would encourage those who have asked the question to just have a look at QRID, which is also an FDA initiated program, which offers the possibility, and it's exactly for that purpose, offers the possibility for any physician to record what it's a bit different from all the cohort studies and all that, but it's just coming from any practitioner who can record his experience on using a drug for another indication than the label one. That's collected, and it's a resource for others to look into.
Thank you. All right, next question. Multiple people have mentioned the slow, expensive, and low success rate for pediatrics. What specific things help improve these odds? So and those data came from that paper published in Pediatric Research summarizing some of the proposed action items, and I've already mentioned the one about academia and promotion. So what came out of that meeting was the establishment of something called the Institute for Advanced Clinical Trials in Children. It's a not-for-profit very much motivated by that forum and funded by many of the industry partners that recognize they need to do work in children. And frankly, they're spinning their wheels when they have to go out to so many sites. So what IACT is doing is getting academic centers that have large patient populations and have the numbers of those with rare diseases and working to set up the infrastructure so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So that way, when industry has a drug they want to study, they know here are the institutions that have signed on and met the bar through IACT. So that doesn't address the specific issues around repurposing, but there's children's hospitals are now signing on to become part of IACT. We think that's really going to be the key. And so there's a portal that an industry sponsor can come into and identify where are the sites where they're likely to overcome those barriers where I talked about trials failing or stalling or not enrolling patients. So it'll be really interesting to see how IACT changes the landscape. The other thing is there's a real call now for some legislative reform around PREA and the Orphan Drug Act. So I think that will be important as well. Any of our speakers want to expand on or maybe give a different viewpoint on things that can help improve the odds in pediatrics? Nope. Okay, we'll move on. Okay, again, for all of you, what's the role of international collaboration in finding pediatric treatments, and how can this collaboration be fostered? Ben or Teresa, I don't know if your work has had an international component as much as Natalie's.
Yeah, definitely. As an international component, Joe, I mean, Kevin and Daria are the ones that are running the best international collaboration I know right now through Spark. So,
oh, good point.
Yeah, so they just, I mean, we talk about the Spark advisors here in the U.S., but or local to Stanford, but they have a whole network of people involved in other Spark or Spark-like programs around the world, and they constantly collaborate on really important topics.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's such an important point. And some of those collaborators from other countries have come here to visit, sort of to learn from them. And I've had the pleasure of meeting some. So you're absolutely right. There's a profound momentum and interest internationally on building on the success of Spark. So thank you for that. The work we've been doing, again, to the American Academy of Pediatrics and the issues around international collaborations, there has been a lot of discussion about harmonizing some of the regulatory pieces, harmonizing, or how do we make sure that if different countries are studying, you know, different drugs and different indications, how do we make sure we're looking at the same outcome measures? And very much recognizing that we can't be doing all of this work in silos. So there are things that have been happening between the US and Europe and for some of those kinds of opportunities. I used to be in those conversations a few years ago. I don't have the most up to the date, but we're very much interested in lessons learned and overcoming some of the barriers when we have different ways of approaching things. Anybody else want to comment on the international one before we go on to the next question? Mindful of the
just say something quickly. So the pediatric brain, when we first started the trial, I wanted to include Toronto sick kids in the trial because just the catchment of the GTA is 4 million. So the number of patients going into that one center was about as equivalent as 6 of the American centers. And so it was almost impossible to do. But what we did end up doing through no work of myself, but the PPTC actually has now included Toronto as a partner of the PPTC. And so once these multi-institutional organizations, which are absolutely necessary for things like pediatric oncology, these brain tumors, once Toronto became part of the PPTC, it became far more feasible to get the drug across the border and things like that. So I think having the consortium set up internationally is a much more streamlined approach than trying to bring in individual centers.
Yeah, that's a great example. And there's lots of really good international consortia, and certainly the Children's Oncology Group is, I think, some 200 plus sites around the world. All right, I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to just ask this last question, very timely. What impact will COVID-19 play in future of pediatric therapy development longer term? So I suppose that has 2 components. One is around therapy for children related to COVID-19, and there's certainly been real outcry about not sufficient children being included in the vaccine studies. So I'm not sure if the question is about COVID-19 as an infection per se, or about how will the pandemic impact the broader issue of drug repurposing. And because I do think it is certainly shelter in place has brought much of our work to a grinding halt. So the question is, what impact will COVID-19 play in future pediatric therapy development long-term? Would anybody like to tackle that from whatever angle you view that question?
So one thing that's quite obvious is that repurposing has been at the core, at the center of finding solutions for COVID. It still is. So that will bring more visibility to the fact that when you repurpose, you save, again, time, money, and regulators are quite, well, they are flexible, and they will help for this. I mean, that's one of the things. I'd like also just to say that I don't think we are doing enough, and we don't understand COVID enough in children. That's the only thing I'd like to add.
Yeah, I think in many ways, COVID has become the poster child for helping people understand what can be done with repurposing. It's a really powerful example, and it's getting people to think much more creatively. Teresa or Ben, anything you want to say about COVID?
Just a general statement. I think, the people that we work with on a day-to-day basis are incredibly bright and incredibly creative, and have proven that they have been able to overcome or deal with effectively issues associated with COVID in ways that are just really, really impressive. So I have confidence that this will stimulate creative thinking, and people will come up with better strategies, and hopefully through this whole process we'll learn, going back to another question, we'll learn how to do things more efficiently.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I've noticed, because I have to sign off on every one of them, the number of my faculty who've never been in the infectious disease space, who've recognized that a technology or a model or a tool they have could be brought to bear on COVID, and have pivoted completely, and now have really compelling work in children with COVID. I could think of 5 examples in people in totally different disciplines, including oncology, who've pivoted to COVID. So it is, I think, really exciting, getting people to think a little bit more nimble, a little outside the box. Okay, with that, I want to thank the panelists, and I want to thank Cures Within Reach for the opportunity to be part of this really wonderful conversation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Mary. This is Barbara Goodman again, and I want to thank all of the speakers, Mary as the moderator. As Ben told us, many, many stories have heroes, and thankfully there are stories that don't have any villains. To close our event today, we are honoring 2 of these heroes today, 2 organizations that have been impacting patients through repurposing, not only for pediatrics, but in many, many other areas. We are thrilled to formally present our annual Global Health Repurposing Awards to 2 of the 3 2020 Patient Impact awardees today. These 3 awards are given annually by Cures Within Reach to industry leaders, scientists, philanthropists, and other organizations who are driving improvements in clinical care through repurposing. In addition to the 2 awards we're giving today, we honored Camargo Pharmaceutical Services last month with the 2020 Patient Impact Industry Award for Camargo's dedication to supporting the regulatory approval and development of proven therapies that enhance patient outcomes through the 505(b)(2) regulatory pathway at the US FDA, plus similar pathways worldwide. First, today, receiving our 2020 Golan Christie Taglia Patient Impact Philanthropy Award is Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. The Golan and Christie Taglia Patient Impact Philanthropy Award is given to an individual, group, or organization that has created positive patient impact by advocating for patients or contributing to the growth of repurposing research through financial, operational, or professional philanthropic support. Named in honor of Golan Christie and Taglia LLP, in gratitude for its many, many years of financial and in-kind support for Cures Within Reach, helping us to grow and thrive. Past recipients of this award include the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, among many others. And as Christina Alickmitz said, an SVP at Takeda Pharmaceuticals and a Cures Within Reach board member, DNDi is a bright spot in the challenging field of global drug development. The organization's commitment to neglected diseases has led to numerous successes in finding treatments for patients through repurposed drugs. Its work has been increasingly recognized in the patient community, the medical community, and the pharmaceutical industry. Claire?
The Golan Christie Taglia Patient Impact Philanthropy Award is given to an organization that has created positive patient impact by advocating for patients or contributing to the growth of repurposing research through financial, operational, or professional philanthropic support. Cures Within Reach presents Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative with the 2020 Golan Christie Taglia Patient Impact Philanthropy Award to honor DNDi's commitment to finding treatments for the underserved patients, largely in the developing world, and its leadership in the development of 8 new treatments from existing molecules and recombining drugs to bring better treatments to patients with malaria, Chagas disease, sleeping sickness, leishmaniasis, and pediatric HIV. Congratulations, DNDi.
Thank you very much. We are really delighted. It's a really great honor for DNDi to receive this Global Health Patient Impact Philanthropy Award from Cures Within Reach. On behalf of DNDi, I would really like to thank you for your recognition of our work for neglected patients for the past 15 years. DNDi in the past 15 years has achieved some of its goals with support from public health partners, researchers from low and middle income countries, funders. But much more remains to be done for neglected tropical diseases, those in our portfolio, but many others too, for children with NTDs or children with rare conditions that remain very often neglected from development strategies. Repurposing efforts, as supported by Cures Within Reach, are indeed accelerators for access to innovation for those in need. And we are therefore particularly proud to receive this award from you. We look forward to continuing exchanges and mutual collaboration for the needs of the forgotten. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and congratulations to the entire Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative team. We're so thrilled to honor you this way this year. Finally, the Janet Davison Rowley Patient Impact Research Award. This award is named for Janet Davison Rowley, whose genetic discoveries related to human leukemia and lymphoma paved the way for imatinib, which has now been repurposed in non-cancer diseases. This award is given to one or more researchers or clinicians who have created positive patient impact through repurposing research. This year, for the first time ever, Cures Within Reach is not awarding this to 1 or 2 people, but instead to an entire program, Spark at Stanford. As Dean of the Stanford University School of Medicine told us, Stanford Medicine is greatly honored that Cures Within Reach has chosen Spark to receive the 2020 Janet Davison Rowley Award. This recognition not only reflects the breadth and depth of drug repurposing at Spark, but it also reaffirms our institutional mission to benefit populations both locally and globally. Dean Miner is grateful to Kevin Grimes and Daria Moakley-Rosen, who have led this visionary translational research program that has become a model for many others around the world. And certainly, as Ben and Teresa have shared with us today, Spark has been impacting patients behind the scenes and very successfully in many, many ways. Claire?
The Janet Davison Rowley Patient Impact Research Award is given to researchers and clinicians who have created positive patient impact through repurposing research. We honor Dr. Rowley and her impact on patients through her clinical care, medical research, and pioneering work that led to the creation of drugs, later repurposed for additional indications. Cures Within Reach presents the Spark at Stanford team with the 2020 Janet Davison Rowley Patient Impact Research Award to honor its interest in and support of the translational development of repurposing opportunities for both commercial and philanthropic treatments for patients with unmet medical needs in a range of diseases with drugs, devices, and other technologies. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And a special thanks to Barbara and Claire, the Cures Within Reach team, and the Cures Within Reach donors and sponsors. I also want to thank Mary Leonard and the Maternal and Child Research Institute for their generosity in supporting SPARC and our pediatric projects over the years. It's an honor to accept this award on behalf of the SPARC founder and my co-director, Daria Mosley-Rosen, the SPARC team, and especially on behalf of the SPARC advisors and the many faculty and trainees who have worked so hard to advance therapies to improve the lives of patients who are in need. We are huge fans of repurposing at SPARC, and in fact, over the past 14 years, about a third of our projects have focused on repurposing. The reasons are obvious for relatively poor academics, faster to patients, lower in cost, and the risks are somewhat mitigated for drugs that have previously been tested in humans. But having said that, there are still challenges. Over the years, I should say, we have had 20 pediatric repurposing projects. Of those 20, 8 have gone on to be handed off to commercial entities, to companies, and 9 have moved forward into clinical trials. So far, only 1 has failed in proof of concept, and we have 6 that are still ongoing. And these have been in indications including Down syndrome, type 1 diabetes, pediatric cancer, cystic fibrosis, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and so forth. Having said that, there are huge challenges trying to advance repurposing projects, mostly around financing. If you are trying to move forward a drug that's currently available on the shelf and should work in that manner in your new indication, it's very hard to fund the clinical trials. And the reality is that virtually all drug development in the United States, and in fact in most of the world, is exclusively a for-profit enterprise. And we need to find ways around that. This has been magnified even more so in COVID-19, as Natalie mentioned, where we really need to bring drugs to patients urgently. People are actively dying, and we want to do whatever we can to help them survive the infection. So it's really critical that we figure out how to put patients at the forefront, and in fact, patients before profit in many instances. I want to thank Cures Within Reach really for their vision. They have been uniquely in the forefront, trying to unite academic and other researchers with the financial and other resources and support that we need to move these projects forward to the patients who need them. I would say that Cures Within Reach and SPARC are truly kindred spirits. Our goals are really to bring therapeutics to patients as quickly as we can and as effectively as we can. So again, I want to express our sincere thanks for this award. We are humbled and honored. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. We're thrilled to have you accept this award on behalf of SPARC, Daria, and the rest of the team. Congratulations for winning the award this year. It is such an important reminder today of how critical patients and the patient voice is, and in this case, with pediatrics specifically, who are rarely heard from, but are so important for those who don't have treatments for their diseases. To close the event, on behalf of Cures Within Reach team, our board of directors, our donors, and our partners, we're so grateful to have all of you join us today. I want to specifically thank our moderator, Mary Leonard, Dr. Mary Leonard, representing Lucille Packard Children's Hospital. Thank you to Teresa, who's representing both Stanford University and the University of Toronto. I want to thank Ben, representing the industry voice in Auration Biotech, as well as Natalie Strub, who's representing not only the not-for-profit voice and the philanthropy voice, but Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative coming at us today from Switzerland. We're also extremely grateful to all the organizations who are listed on the screen right now. Our repurposing community members come from industry, from service providers, they come from philanthropy and are critical to our work, and they're critical to bringing us bringing us the support and allowing us to have this event to patients and for the entire community. I also want to thank our patient education sponsors who are listed on this slide as well. It's so grateful to all of you who are participating, to all of you who support us, and we look forward to working with all of you on many, many more treatments for the pediatric community and repurposing and in the future. Thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.